I'm Stephen Ellison. I work for a company called The Light Source. And yes, we do make LEDs, but today I want to talk in generic terms about LED fixtures and the difference between LED fixtures and what were the original fixtures we started with. If you go back far enough, it was candles, but we're not going to go that far back. But to go back and compare against the metrics that were tungsten halogen, or even before that, just regular tungsten filaments. How much has changed? Well, we talk about basic fixtures. Let me get my PowerPoint going for you. And we'll give you some idea what I'm talking about. So this is lighting fixture metrics we want to talk about. What are performance metrics? Just so you know, it's a fun term, sounds good. It's the data we're going to talk about for a fixture. These metrics are defined by organizations outside of the manufacturer that's making the fixture. So your IES files, things like that. An example is measurement. You know, straight standard thing. How big is it? So that's a very fixed value. The National Institute of Standards and Technologies actually publishes and maintains, you know, how big is something. The United States, we deal with inches. Everybody else in the world deals with millimeters. But there are precise measurements. So we can't change that. That's a performance metric that the manufacturer has no option but to give you the real thing, because you can check it. You know, your tape measure is just as good as theirs. So let's talk about optics. This is a metric which can make a big deal of difference to you. You're going to want to care about optics because that's how much coverage you've got. Beam angle. So the beam angle is going to tell you your coverage, and a lot of manufacturers are presenting you with what the beam angle is, and then they give you a cone diagram, and the diagram is set up such that you've got feet, so you've got distance away. It'll tell you how big an area that is going to cover, and then it'll tell you how many foot candles you'll have at that distance. So that's an important thing to worry about, is, you know, when you're beginning to look at things, is how much you're going to get coverage. When you get to doing house lights, that's going to make a big difference, though, because you actually want wider coverage from a fixture, which means you're going to get less foot candles from each fixture. But if you want to get even coverage, you're going to get overlap. It's the same kind of thing you do with front light. If you want to make sure that as your pastor walks back side to side, if you can't get him to stay right there at the podium and he walks a 20-foot path across the front of the stage or even wider, you're going to want to have him not walking in and out of the light. And that's a big thing to, you know, worry about, is to how do you make sure he doesn't do that, especially for video, because now everything's video. We're doing all this virtual stuff. And so you want to make sure your front light for him is really nice and even. So you want to have a lot of overlap of fixtures so that you get no holes, no dark spots or bright spots. So you may consider a wider beam angle. And so some fixtures are designed for just tight beam angles. You know, you want that beam angle that's really tight, and you got the smoke going, and you get these, you know, the lights flashing from behind and up, and you get these pretty beams. Well, that's not what you want when you're trying to get the pastor covered. So you're going to look at that information. That becomes very important to understand. And so different manufacturers are going to say, well, at 20 feet, I achieve this many foot candles, and I get you a 13 foot, you know, coverage area. Same fixture type from a different manufacturer might have different information for that same beam angle. So something to think about. When we get down to lenses, that is more referencing not the focusing fixtures, but the wash fixtures, because a wash fixture is going to cover a lot of area. So you could have individual lenses. So you've got those eye candy fixtures where they can show different lenses and tell you which you can do little pictures on the fixture itself. I saw one just the other day where the Martin fixture could actually have the name Martin go across the fixture. But now you're seeing lots of little individuals. A single lens will give you more homogeneous of a beam, and so you don't see the individual LEDs. You may have an LED array, but you're not seeing the individual array LEDs. You want homogeneous, because when they first started coming out and they had these little LED, and they were doing the popcorn LEDs, but they had different colors. So they would have an RGB fixture, but you'd have, if you put your hand up and look at the shadow your hand was creating, you might have 3 or 4 different color shadows, as opposed to a single color shadow that you would get from a normal tungsten halogen fixture with a color filter in front of it. So that makes a big difference. The other question is, with the optics, can you zoom? Can you change that beam angle? Better fixtures do that. Your Fresnel fixtures that, we started out, a Fresnel lens is an old lens, goes back to the, early days when they were doing lighthouses. A lighthouse had a big Fresnel lens because it would help shape the beam so that you're getting a certain amount of a tight beam, and that, zoom, sent the light out for the boat to see in the dark. Well, now the zoom allows us to take a Fresnel and use it for different options. So you could have a couple Fresnels set up as backlight or side light. And for one look, you want the tight beam. You want to go from that, 10 degree, but you may also want to go all the way out to 50 degree for a different look. Now you're going to change the amount of foot candles, because as you zoom, as you open up the lens, you're changing how much area you're covering. And so you're taking the same foot candles and covering a lot more area. Just something to think about. So moving on. So let's get into the LED itself, because that's really the part of the fixture where we're going to make a big difference. Some of the things to think about. Is it an array or is it a chip on board cob, which is essentially an array, a tiny array under a one lens. Not saying either is good or bad. It's just there are different methods of doing it. LED colors. How many colors are they offering? A lot of people, the RGB. Well, when they first came out, they said, oh, we can do 16 million colors just by blending the R, the G, and the B together. And yeah, no, you can't quite get. There are some colors you'll never get right. It's like when they first came out with them, I had a friend who was very famous for saying, you'll never get your yellow rubber ducky to look yellow. And he was right. You couldn't ever get that yellow that would then reflect. Because basically, how do you know it's a yellow rubber ducky? Because it's reflecting yellow back. And if you don't have yellow hitting it, you'll never get the reflecting back. So that's something to think about. People are adding more colors. They're adding red, green, blue, and now we're doing amber. Well, amber will get you that yellow. They're adding lime, which extends the gamut. And gamut is something we're going to talk about. But that gives you that extension out so you can actually play with the colors. You may want just a pure white LED so that you can pick the color temperature of the white. Although if you pick a color temperature with white, you can actually, by having the other colors available, also change the color temperature that the fixture is outputting. Lumen output. How much is that LED putting out? That's an important thing to talk about. And everybody's going to tout that their lumens are better than the next guy's. Well, one thing to think about is, when did they make that measurement? you'll see a lot of people say it's hot lumen output. Well, what is hot lumen output? Well, when you fire up an LED and it's cold, because it's been sitting there at room temperature, it's going to put out the most output it will ever put out. As you heat it up and it achieves a thermal temperature that, is going to be steady at, so it's reached its thermal balance, you'll have what's called thermal droop. It will actually go down in output. So if you look at it in the first 30 seconds, you're going to see one thing. If you wait a couple minutes, you're actually going to then know what the actual output you're going to have on a normal basis. So look for people giving you lumen output hot, not just lumen output, because you never know. Is it, did they let it sink in? Did they let that heat actually go for a while and then take the measurement? So another thing is a CCT, the correlated color temperature, which is in Kelvin. This is and I'm going to show you a chart which shows you a really nice way to look at correlated color temperature. But basically, is it warm or is it cool? It's talking about the white. And white is never an easy subject. People think, oh, it's white light. Well, no, there's a lot of differences. I'll show you a couple pictures at the end of this that show you the difference. We'll talk about CRI, color rendering index, and actually why the color rendering index is not a valuable metric anymore working with LEDs. It was fine for incandescent lamps, but it's not very good for LEDs. The color gamut, that's an interesting thing to look at. It's a chart that you can look at to get some idea of where the fixtures land and what you can get out of a fixture, how much color, because you're going to reach a limit. I mean, I love to say that, we have now achieved more blue than we will ever achieve in a light. And that's because the color gamut of LEDs, is better in the blue range to some degree. I say that way because LEDs are brighter. The blues are actually much brighter. We're getting a lot more lumen output from the blue LEDs than we ever did from an incandescent. And why is that? Because the incandescents have almost no blue output from the lamp. And therefore you put a color filter in, and color filters basically filter out everything but the color they're outputting. So if you don't have much blue to begin with, you don't get much out. So we would always have to, if I wanted a really dark blue to show up, I would have to double up the number of fixtures I use to even begin to see it, compared to the amber, which I could get plenty of light out of. And the last thing we'll talk about is TM3018, an ANSI standard that is coming into its own. It is much better than CRI. So let's talk about the correlated color temperature, the CCT. This is something you've heard about. Is it a warm white or is it a cool white? Going from 2700K up to 7000K. You've got all these things. Typically 5600, 57K, 3000K, those are standard things we look at. Anywhere between 27 and 3K or 3200 was the tungsten halogen standard. That's what we had to deal with for a long time. When you got to arc lamps, you jumped suddenly up to 5600. So now you're getting into more the daylight range. And basically you're changing the amount of blue and red that you're outputting. Essentially that. So it's a question of what do you want? At one point, GE came out with the reveal light bulb. Better, easier on your eyes to read off a white page. Well, what did they do? They took your standard 3000K lamp filament and they put a blue filter on the inside of the lamp. If you look at it when it's turned off, it looks blue. And it brought up the color temperature, which is true. You put that high color temperature on a white light, it's much easier. If you look at the top of that chart where it says 4100K, precise, clean, efficient. Well, that's essentially, yeah, that's what it did. It made it easier to read. But we also like the 2700K because that takes us back to our days of fireplaces and fires and candles and candlelight. And you just like that. But that's really, it's just a measurement, and Kelvin is all you talk about. You don't talk about degrees Kelvin, you just talk about Kelvin because it's a straight up scale. So color rendering index. It's how closely the observed light can render colors like the sun using 8 color samples only, and they weren't very saturated. You switch to going to TM30, and now you have a fidelity index. That's how closely the observed light can render colors like the sun, and they use 99 color samples to figure out what they're doing. And they also use a gamut index. See, CRI only gives you one number. Fidelity index for TM30 is the, so CRI is the R little a. Fidelity index is going to be the R little f. And they also have the R little g. And that's how saturated or desaturated colors are. So they'll give you a number. And again, numbers are great. CRI just gives you a number. TM30 actually gives you a graphic. That the color vector graphic shows you which colors are saturated and desaturated. And I'll show you what one of those looks like. And it also tells you whether there's a hue shift in any of the 16 color bins. One other one was the color quality scale. Here they're using 15 highly saturated colors. It was an alternative to the unsaturated CRI, but it got superseded more by the TM30, which is doing a much better job. So here's a color sample chart. You can see the top 8, the R1 through R8 color test patches, and you can see there's not even a good human color in there, human skin color. There isn't a good saturated color. You'll find that they expanded it to R9 through R14, and R9 becomes important because that is red, and that begins to show off the differences. You'll find that suddenly where a tungsten lamp is 100 on the CRI, a lot of LEDs go down to 80 because they just don't have a lot of red. The CQS color samples down below that show you the 15, and they are much more saturated. Again, they don't have a really good, like the TCS 13, which is more flesh tone. They don't have a good flesh tone. So looking at CRI values, your incandescent halogen is 95 to 100, and that's by definition because that's what they started with. This is an old slide that I use, but it's kind of fun because like fluorescents were always below 75 to 85. One thing that happened when they first came out with fluorescents, they didn't have a lot of red, and they put them into supermarkets because they were they were more efficient light and better and cheaper and easier to use. But without the red, the meat looked brown and your apples looked brown. So they had to develop fluorescents that actually did make that happen. Whereas your high pressure sodium is more used in big areas, not traffic lights, but highway lighting. Low pressure sodium is even worse. That's that yellow thing that they do a lot of, well, they're changing. I don't see them as much anymore, but they used to be more prevalent for highway lighting, and they almost have no value. A white LED 85 is pretty good. This goes back to 2011 where they were getting 90 plus. You can always request the higher CRI value for an LED. You just pay more for it because they've got to get you into that. And then again is like you're talking CRI. Do you really care about the CRI? So these are the color gamut charts put out by CIE, which is French. So I'm not going to try and pronounce what that means. But they developed the first one in 1931. And then you can see 1976, they sort of shifted it and got a little better. That black line, curved line running through it is the Planckian curve. That defines the black body locus that the curve that you find that defines white light. So as you see along there, you go from 2,000 to 10,000, and that's the correlated color temperature. It shows they're just different in where they've got them, but anywhere along that, and you see lines along that represent that, like the 4,000. Well, it extends into the green and down into the pink. So anywhere along that line, you're at 4,000 on the color correlated temperature, but you're going to have a shift into whether it is actually how white it is, or could it be a little on the green side or a little on the pink side. Just for the fun of it, looking at a typical white fluorescent, you see that it doesn't have a lot of red, but it's got some interesting spikes. And if you've ever had to deal with the high intensity mercury lamps, notice they've got almost no red, spikes of green, and interesting, they're right around 550, which is the eye's best color. So your eye actually likes 550 nanometers, but it's got a spike of blue, and it's got a spike really down there close to the bottom edge right there at 400. So here's the CQS, and they have those 15. In the upper left, it is the red. It's got actually the blue, green, and red. So that's an RGB model. And it's showing you this poor color. You can see down at 500, there's almost no output. So you're not going to have good output there. The CRI is 80, the CQS is 73. And that's for a 3300 color temperature. The DUV, the distance off of that Planckian curve, is 0. So it's pretty straightforward. But you can see the color gamut going into the red is in that CIE lab chart. You can see how it's getting off. So you can see that the reference for VS14 looks real red, while the test looks brown. So they're showing you that they're not getting all the colors precisely matched. Another version of looking at that same kind of chart, test and reference. This came from the NIST Standards Division. So TM30, this is the new one, developed in 2015 by the IES, the Illumination Engineering Society. What they evaluate is color fidelity, color gamut, color vector graphic. So it came out with it in 2015, but in 2018, it became an ANSI standard. So now we're really able to make a lot of use of it. What I want to do is switch screens. If I can find my mouse again. And I want to show you some charts showing you the quit that. So this is a chart. I have a meter from a company called Spectrum Genius. You can see this picture. That's a lamp in my kitchen. Nice tungsten halogen lamp. You can see it's tungsten. You can see it has an interesting dip in the red. But you can see that this is a tungsten, fairly standard. It's got a lot of red. It has almost no blue. You can see what I was talking about, that if I filter out everything from where I am here over, say we're going to get rid of all that, I don't have a lot of lumens to work with. You know, the CIE X and Y relate to where you'd plot on that color gamut, or the U and the V are on the CIE. This is the 31, this is the 76. This lamp has a CCT, so it's 2571, fairly standard for that kind of lamp. The DUV, where it is, if we look on the chart, it's compared to the Planckian curve, it's going to be in a plus, so it's a little towards the green. The CRI is 99, that's pretty good, on the R1 through 8, and even the R1 through R15 is 98. The CQS is 98, so it's still pretty solid. TLCI, I'm going to just tell you what that is. That's the Television Lighting Consistency Index. Not very important to us because we're not doing a lot of television, but if you care, that's what it is. The gamut area index is useless to us, so we don't need to worry about that. The GAI, it's just that this meter can do a lot of stuff. The RF and the RG are 99, which puts it pretty much straight up, which you would expect. The lux, illuminance, and the foot candles. Now, the foot candle reading, be very careful about, because what this doesn't tell you or in any way reference is how far away from the fixture the meter was. So that's something you have to input. So we're not going to worry about that. So I would ignore the foot candle, and I would ignore the illuminance, because unless you define precisely how far away it is. Now this chart down here, this is the vector graphic, and you can see it basically both circles. This guy it's barely not out there. That is, the vector graphic you're going to see. So you can see here on the 1931 and the 76, we're pretty much right on that Planckian curve. We're barely off it. If it's any, it's off. I said to the green, but in this area, it's only going to be off a little into the amber, and we would expect that. I'm not going to talk about McAdams ellipses, but basically that's just a defined where it is. And McAdams is another complex thing to talk about. So I doubt you're going to run into that. If somebody gives you that information, they're just trying to impress you. Now let's take a look at another report, because this one's a little different. Notice now, it says test 1. I don't have a picture of the fixture, but notice you got a bigger spike in the blue. You've got a lot more blue. So now this is where I was talking about. I get more blue out of these LEDs, and this is a white light fixture, but I'm getting a lot more blue. I'm losing a lot of red. So the curve is a lot different. And you see here, R9 is way down. So we're beginning to see that we're not getting as much of the reds. So here, the CRI is 84, R1 through R, which doesn't take into account R9. When you take into account R9, you're at 79. But your RF and RG are not as, show off more that you're not as bad. The fidelity's 84 is pretty good. The RG is 95. That's, again, let's not worry about the lux and the illuminance, the foot candles. Oh, PPFD, I forgot to mention that. We really don't care about that unless you're interested in growing plants. The PPFD stands for the photosynthetic photon flux density. And if you see here, it's in micromoles. So that's not something, unless you're into growing things, to know what that is important. But now we're looking at this TM30 color graphic, and you can see at R9, it just dumps way in. So this is something where you can look at this and you can begin to see where you're off and where you're not in what you're looking at. So let's go back to my wonderful PowerPoint. Oops. Well. So just for the fun of it, to show you at the end, we're going to show you some pictures. This is LED fixtures, PAR fixtures, uplighting a black curtain. So you can actually get a lot out of them, and that's a lot of punch, which was not necessarily achievable. Now, if you look at this, this is a picture of somebody in a follow spot. The follow spot is at the 6500 or 5600 color temperature, yet he looks in white. The difference is, if you're dealing with your cameras, you can white balance, so you're seeing that as a white light, as opposed to white balancing for tungsten. You white balance based on the color temperature of the light you're dealing with. Whereas she is not in she's in just a nice tungsten halogen lamp. So you're getting that nice amber glow. Now this guy is in that same follow spot that the other guy was in. What's the difference? I was color temperature balanced for the picture before of the girl. So I'm color balanced for her, white balanced. And when I look at him, suddenly he appeared blue. Well, that's because the output of the 5600, it's the camera sees it as 3200, and therefore he appears blue. So it's something, since now we're dealing a lot with video right now, because everybody's streaming, you want to pay attention to matching all of your color temperatures, your correlated color temperatures, so you can white balance to one thing and not have to deal with odd color shifts when you go between lights. Here again, it doesn't make a difference. This is a church I did. The ceiling's very tight, but you can see the colors are also saturated. It made no difference what the color, what I color white balance to, because I'm not going to have that issue. Here you've got the same kind of thing. The sides, the uplights, they don't make a difference. I just made sure they look good, but the other lights are LED. They are LEDs, but they're 3200. Same kind of thing here, the LED uplights. And I can't take, it looks like that's a flame effect, but that's not really. It's because cameras don't do a good job doing LEDs, but they're all nicely balanced. This is using front light LEDs. So the singers are all lit with LEDs, and it turns out gorgeous. Same thing here. This was a demonstration of different lights. And so you can see that we've got yellow, we've got red, we've got blues. You can get the full color out of these white LEDs now, so you're not worrying about it. So just, that's something to ask is, can you see that spectrum graph that shows you how much of what colors you're getting? Because if you're not seeing some color, you're not going to get it reflected off the whatever you're trying to light. This is fun with house lights, the immersive technology that you can now make the house lights in the house all go color. So that's the end of the presentation for you.